Good morning, everyone. My name is Deirdre Delbert. I'm professor of English and dean of the college here at Bayard College in Annandale. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to Bayard and to the 11th annual Hannah Arendt Center Conference. If this is your first visit to Annandale, please allow me to encourage you to wander the almost 1,000 acres of our campus overlooking the Hudson River. Even on a rainy day, I promise it'll be worth the walk. And for those of you who are first-time attendees of the conference, welcome to you too. Many among you today, students, faculty, and friends of the college already know Bayard well, and many of you have been faithful attendees of this conference since its inauguration in 2006. We appreciate your ongoing commitment to the work of the center and to sustained critical dialogue around the legacy of Hannah Arendt's thought. In particular, I want to extend a very warm welcome to colleagues and students who have made a long drive up the Hudson River to Annandale from many of our Bayard High School early college programs. We greet you Bardians who come from as far away as Baltimore and New Orleans, as well as Queens, Manhattan, and Hudson. You are most welcome. Yeah. It is my honor to help open the 11th annual conference of the Hannah Arendt Center, and the theme could not be more timely: citizenship and civil disobedience. For many Americans, the concept of civil disobedience is linked importantly to the civil rights movement and to writings of Dr. Martin Luther King, and that will be part of the conversation over the next 2 days. Also to the 1849 essay of the same name by Henry David Thoreau. But what does civil disobedience mean for us today? Conference goers over the next 2 days will have the opportunity to enter into sustained critical engagement with one another and with a wide range of noted scholars, theorists, and activists around profoundly contested meanings of both terms: citizenship and civil disobedience. The Hannah Arendt Center, since its founding, has dedicated itself to creating space for such contemporary concerns, even as it sustains archival and scholarly projects investigating the ongoing importance of Arendt as philosopher and political thinker. We know that her writings address topics as diverse as totalitarianism, revolution, the nature of freedom, and what it means to think and judge. The questions with which Arendt engaged most frequently are surrounding politics and the political life. This conference is a laboratory or workshop for exactly this kind of work. And as an institution of higher education, Bayard consistently asks its students to think across disciplines and boundaries, even as Arendt herself did. Bayard students learn by questioning and by doing. Last night, the annual Bayard West Point debate centered on the resolution, "Must dissent in democracy be civil and nonviolent?" And it was a very lively debate indeed. Members of the class, How to Change the World, will be presenting their ideas for discussion with you all later today. And students are encouraged to participate, as they are every year, in a contest to argue questions having to do with citizenship and disobedience. The focus on student learning and engagement has been a hallmark of the Hannah Arendt Center Conference from the start. And I would say, on a personal note, it has also been crucial to all of the work of the center's academic director, Roger Berkowitz, professor of political studies, philosophy, and human rights at Bayard College. Roger Berkowitz is the author of The Gift of Science, Leibniz and the Modern Legal Tradition, as well as edited volumes on Arendt and countless essays on related topics. His intellectual commitments are bold and heterodox. Roger speaks often in his writing and teaching about developing the capacity for courage, both in one's thinking and in one's actions, in a world that expects even demands obedience. Without further ado, allow me to introduce to you Roger Berkowitz, the guiding spirit of inquiry and debate behind this conference. Professor Berkowitz.
Thank you, Deirdre, for that beautiful introduction. I say this a lot, sometimes here and sometimes in person and in private, which means I think it's true, which is that it's a real honor and pleasure to work at a school like Bard, where a place to think is not only a motto, but embraced by the faculty and the students, but also the administrators, and something I value quite highly. So thank you, Deirdre, for that. Before I begin, I just also want to thank Tina Stanton, who makes this conference possible every year as our Director of Operations, and the students who work with her. So please thank Tina. In the years leading up to the Civil War, there were more than 70 violent clashes between representatives and senators in Congress. In her book, Field of Blood, Violence in Congress and the Road to Civil War, Yale historian Johanna Freeman tells a story of a raucous antebellum Congress replete with bullying, dueling, and fistfights. Even now, amidst the bitter animosity that pervades Washington, D.C., it takes some effort to imagine our elected officials engaging in regular canings, duels, fistfights, or to learn that they were brandishing pistols and knives and even flinging the occasional brick through the Capitol building. But all this was happening in Congress in the 2 decades before the Civil War. The fighting in Congress reflected the country at large. In 4 months during 1835 alone, there were 109 riots across the United States. The murderous battles of Bloody Kansas in 1850 actually played out a mini Civil War between pro-slavery Missourians and anti-slavery Kansans. And John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry unleashed a tide of anger on both sides of the national debate over slavery. While the violence in Congress began with Southern Democratic congressmen intimidating Northern abolitionists, Freeman says that something changed in 1856. Suddenly, a new class of Republican congressmen decided to fight back. The abolitionists stood up to intimidation from the South and met threat with defiance and force with force. As a result, the 34th Congress was the most violent in history and culminated in the now well-known barbaric caning of Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner after his crime against Kansas speech. The speech insinuated that certain Southern senators and Southern slaveholders were holding on to slavery, at least partly for reasons of sexual mastery. This led Representative Preston Brooks, a relative of one of those senators, to walk up to Sumner and cane him mercilessly until Sumner was carried away, bloody and barely conscious. I bring this up not to suggest that we're about to have a second Civil War, although I don't rule out the possibility. Last year, Foreign Policy magazine asked a group of national security analysts to evaluate the chances of a civil war in the United States over the next 10 to 15 years. The answers they gave ranged from 5% to 95%. The average was 35%. And this was before the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. Keith Mines, a Special Forces officer turned diplomat, estimated the probability at 60%. And this is what he said: violence is in as a method to solve disputes and get one's way. The president modeled violence as a way to advance politically and validated bullying during and after the campaign. Judging from recent events, the left is now fully on board with this, although it has been going on for several years with them as well. Consider the university events where professors or speakers are shouted down and harassed, the physically aggressive anti-Israel events, and the anarchists during globalization events. It is like 1859. Everyone is mad about something and everyone has a gun. Well, it is like 1859, and it is not. Hannah Arendt reminded us not to see too much wisdom in history. She warned repeatedly that the present is always unprecedented, and we must look upon it fresh. But in her essay, Civil Disobedience, Arendt does write that history can teach us about revolution. She writes, "If history teaches us anything about the causes of revolution, it is that a disintegration of political systems precedes revolutions, that the telling symptom of disintegration is a progressive erosion of governmental authority, and that this erosion is caused by the government's inability to function properly, from which spring the citizens' doubts about its legitimacy. This is what the Marxists used to call a revolutionary situation, which, of course, more often than not, does not develop into a revolution." It is fair to say that we today are at least in some way experiencing some version of a revolutionary situation, one in which large numbers of citizens reject the legitimacy of our established institutions. Just this week, in the New York Times, Emily Badger offered some insight into this revolutionary situation. 2 years into the Trump presidency, 47% of Trump supporters feel like strangers in their own country. At the same time, 44% of those who disapprove of Trump say they feel like strangers in their own country. It is not simply that people disagree. An overwhelming majority of Americans, people in power and people out of power, persons of color and white people, and women and men, all feel alienated, rootless, and powerless in their own country. We are at one of those rare moments at which the country sits at a pivotal point amidst the conflict of fundamental values. At such moments, as in the 1850s, violence and even civil war are very real possibilities. We should not be shocked that violence is a possibility in America today. One of the most prescient observers of America, Hannah Arendt, well understood how the United States is a fertile ground for violence. In her essay, published in the New York Times in 1968, called "Is America by Nature a Violent Society?" Arendt writes, "It seems true that America, for historical, social, and political reasons, is more likely to erupt into violence than most other civilized countries. American propensity to violence," she writes, "coexists with the country's deep respect for law. The paradox between violence and lawfulness is rooted in the American traditions of political activism and freedom of assembly, which for Arendt are among the crucial, most cherished, and perhaps most dangerous rights of American citizens. This is really essential for her, precisely because our constitutionally guaranteed rights of assembly, speech, and activism are so strong. The United States are perennially threatened with disunity and fundamental dissent." And she continues, "Every time Washington is unreceptive to the claims of a sufficiently large number of citizens, the danger of violence arises. Violence, taking the law into one's own hands, is perhaps more likely to be the consequence of frustrated power in America than in other countries." So let me just recap what I think I've tried to say so far, which is this. First, we are in a revolutionary situation. There is a fundamental conflict of values, one in which a majority of Americans from multiple backgrounds feel like strangers in their own land. Second, in the United States, such situations can lead easily to political activism and violence. Third, history is not fate. Our situation today is not the same as the 1850s. A civil war is not inevitable. Which brings me to the question of this conference. Is civil disobedience the kind of active citizenship that has and might again bring about revolutionary change without a civil war? Arendt's prime example of how civil disobedience can be revolutionary and refound a body politic is the civil rights movement. The 14th Amendment, passed after the Civil War, supposedly guaranteed all Americans equal protection of the law. But the 14th and 15th Amendments, she writes, were meant to translate into constitutional terms the change that had come about as a result of the Civil War, but the South resisted that change and developed the system of Jim Crow, which led to separate but equal. In Arendt's telling, the amendments failed to bring about the promised revolutionary refounding of America. And that revolution, to the extent it did happen, only happened, she argues, as a product of civil disobedience. Of the leaders of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, one of the most central in defining a strategy of civil disobedience that aimed at what I think we can call a political revolution is Bayard Rustin. In 1963, in the wake of Bull Connor's attacks on the civil rights demonstrators in Birmingham, Alabama, Rustin was instrumental in organizing the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The march is best known today for King's "I Have a Dream" speech. And Rustin is one of the leaders of the movement who is too often overlooked. But it was Rustin who traveled to Montgomery in 1956 to help organize the bus boycott. It was Rustin who introduced Martin Luther King to Gandhi's thinking on nonviolent resistance. Rustin was one of the first to expand the civil rights movement politically by demonstrating against nuclear testing in North Africa. And it was Rustin who was forced to resign from the Southern Leadership Conference because of controversy over his sexual orientation. As a gay communist African-American man who believed passionately in a nonviolent revolution, Rustin is one of the great, if unsung, heroes of the civil rights movement's strategy of civil disobedience. In 1965, Rustin wrote a seminal manifesto called "From Protest to Politics, the Future of the Civil Rights Movement." He argues that the destruction of legal racism is only the first phase of the civil rights struggle. To bring about true civil rights, the movement would have to morph from fighting legal racism to bringing about political equality. He writes, quote, "The minute the movement faced this question, it was compelled to expand its vision beyond race relations to economic relations. What this means is that the revolution in civil rights could no longer be a matter of protesting unjust laws. It must transform itself," he argued, "from a protest movement to a political movement. It must, he must become," he writes, "a conscious bid for political power." In the second stage of the movement, the struggle for the civil rights is essentially revolutionary. And Rustin writes, quote, "I believe that the Negro's struggle for equality in America is essentially revolutionary. The term revolutionary, as I am using it, does not connote violence. It refers to the qualitative transformation of fundamental institutions, more or less rapidly, to the point where social and economic structures which they comprised can no longer be said to be the same." The struggle for civil rights, he claims, will not stop moving until either it has been utterly defeated or it will win substantial political equality. In his words, civil rights can only be won when it achieves a revolution that brings about full employment, the abolition of slums, the reconstruction of our educational system, and a new definition of work and leisure. He continues, quote, "Adding up the cost of such programs, we can only conclude that we are talking about a refashioning of our entire political economy." What Rustin called a revolution, Hannah Arendt calls politics, and she names that revolutionary politics civil disobedience. For both Rustin and Arendt, civil disobedience is a revolutionary form of politics. The core of Arendt's argument about civil disobedience is that it is a means of active and collective political dissent. She writes, "Civil disobedience arises when a significant number of citizens have become convinced either that the normal channels of change no longer function and their grievances will not be heard or acted upon, or that, on the contrary, the government is about to change and has embarked upon and persists in modes of action whose legality and constitutionality are open to grave doubt." As an activity of dissent, civil disobedience has the political capacity to re-energize democratic citizenship and free it from its corruption. The great threat to democracy, Arendt writes, is the atrophy of active citizenship. Democracy, or at least American constitutional democracy, as she understands it, is founded upon the principle that multiple and diverse communities with unique value systems can coexist within a government of freedom. Freedom, however, is not simply a negative absence of power. For her, to be free and to act are the same. Freedom is the power to act together to build a public world. Arendt understands the danger of representative democracies of the kind that we currently have in this way. She writes, representative government is in crisis today, partly because it has lost, in the course of time, all institutions that permitted the citizens' actual participation, and partly because it is not gravely affected by the disease from which the party system suffers, bureaucratization and the two parties' tendency to represent nobody except the party machines. Because large and bureaucratic democracies tend toward centralization of power and the disempowering of citizens, democracies, she writes, will need to experience perennially episodes of refoundation. Such moments, she writes, are central to the democratic spirit of the United States, and Arendt argues that civil disobedience is a modern reemergence of the American tradition of political association and democracy. The rise of civil disobedience, she argues, is a sign of a revolutionary situation. But revolutionary situations rarely lead to revolutions. More often, as she reminds us again, they lead to counter-revolution or to nothing at all. So let me conclude my remarks here by saying that I believe that we stand before a question of what kind of politics we will embrace today in our revolutionary situation. One option will lead to violence and war. We can also seek to muddle through without confronting the fullness of the revolutionary nature of our present crisis. But a third option, I think, involves citizenship along the lines of what Arendt means by civil disobedience. For Arendt, civil disobedience must be nonviolent for the simple reason that civil disobedience, unlike revolution, seeks to revolutionize the world, but it ultimately accepts the frame of established authority and the system of laws. Violence can change the world, but violence, as one of the West Point cadets said in our debate last night, opens a Pandora's box of unpredictable and uncontrollable evils. Or as Arendt writes, violence may change the world, but more often than not, violence simply leads to more violence. The civil disobedient shares with the revolutionary the wish to change the world, and the changes he or she wishes to accomplish can be drastic. But in the end, civil disobedience affirms a shared world. The challenge in our particular moment is that so many concurrent organized minorities are battling to have their own fundamental American values prevail. From Antifa, Occupy, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, and Sanctuary City movements, to the Tea Party, border patriots, fake news, and fundamentalist bakers in Colorado, the tradition of American political association is being reinvigorated as a form of mass political citizenship. Amidst this opposing yet concurrent minorities, there is a tendency to turn political adversaries into political enemies. And I want to suggest this is a mistake. I am not calling for a centrist politics of compromise, nor am I calling for a rational consensus that mitigates the real differences amongst us. The aim of a Arendtian democracy is not one that produces a thick consensus on fundamental values. Instead, I am arguing for a political democratic ideal of active citizenship. Over the next 2 days, you're going to meet and hear from a lot of people with different political and personal and professional backgrounds. You'll find some thrilling and some provocative and annoying. My hope is that you see those with whom you disagree as your adversaries rather than as your enemies. I borrow this distinction between adversary and enemy from Chantal Mouffe, who will speak to you tomorrow. For Mouffe, democracy is about the struggle between opposing and ultimately irreconcilable ways of life. To see your political antagonists as adversaries and not enemies means that while their values conflict with your own, it is still possible to see them and have them see you as belonging to the same political community. To see them as adversaries and not enemies is to affirm that despite the real and fundamental differences that divide you, you can send your children to school with their children, sit next to them in a restaurant, laugh with them at a party, and cry with them at a funeral. Or at the very least, I ask you to see this possibility of a democratic space as the question before us. We stand before this question. Is it possible still to imagine a political community that shares a common world while disagreeing about fundamental values? Hannah Arendt thinks it is possible to do so, to share a world with your adversary. Invoking Socrates, she writes, we become more just and more pious by thinking and talking about justice and piety. In talking with one another, we create the kinds of shared experiences and common points of connections that might, over time, become the building blocks of a new shared world. In talking about the world, we also make judgments and decisions. Those decisions, Arendt admits, may one day prove wholly inadequate. But even absent agreements on the nature of the crisis and how to solve it, the act of speaking with one another about the crisis of our times will, Arendt argues, eventually lay the groundwork for new agreements between ourselves as well as between the nations of the earth. Arendt sees this potential rebirth of a new common world as not only possible, but likely. She writes, quote, I personally do not doubt from the turmoil of being confronted with reality without the help of precedent, that is, of tradition and authority, there will finally arise some new code of conduct, end quote. The only way to constructively engage the crisis of our time, Arendt argues, is to confront the reality that we do indeed live in a time of crisis and talk honestly about it with others. I wish you, over the next 2 days, a thoughtful conference, a provocative conference full of talking and listening about justice and piety. So, I'd like now to welcome our first keynote speaker of the day, Theda Skocpol, and Peter Rosenblum, my colleague, who will introduce her. Thank you.
Hi, welcome. I'm Peter Rosenblum, and I teach in human rights here at Bayard College. I'm very honored to introduce and to welcome Professor Theda Skocpol. Professor Skocpol is a major figure in the world of sociology and government, whose name we've all heard, many of us throughout our careers, though never tried to pronounce. And her articles and her books have formed a part of our own educations. Her reputation is one of being a great colleague, scholar, and member of the intellectual community. Although in my time at Harvard, I was far away from the world of sociology, I would hear about her through graduate students, and I think that's perhaps the best advertisements and worst insults that can be that can be heard about any professor. And in the case of Professor Skocpol, they came with the highest regard and appreciation from those students that worked with her. She is the Victor S. Thompson Professor of Government and Sociology at Harvard and has been elected to all 3 of America's highest honor societies. She's the author of at least a dozen books probing government and society, and another 10 edited works exploring some of the same subjects. Much of her recent work has been on the Tea Party in American society, and in other related issues of contemporary American policy in government. I can't think of a better speaker to launch us after Roger's initial comments in thinking about the question of active citizenship, this aspiration of Hannah Arendt and for many of us, and of ideas of participation, it's interesting to pause and reflect on what has been perhaps, and Professor Skocpol will explore this and perhaps contradict this, one of the best examples of engaged and active citizenship, of participation that we've seen from a new movement in America, the Tea Party, and one which doesn't necessarily look as if it has led to broader, deeper agreements among society, but rather further polarization and commitments to values that many of us find deeply problematic. So new agreements or new divisions, I'm not sure, but I know that with Professor Skocpol we'll have an opportunity to explore what the Tea Party means, has meant, and what it signals to us today about the challenges ahead. So thank you very much. Let's all welcome Professor Theda Skocpol.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Right. Oops, I think I messed this up here. How do we get this to hold in place? Well, maybe it'll be all right. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm very grateful for the invitation to speak at Bard College. It's my first visit, and at a conference in honor of a remarkable thinker, Hannah Arendt. And I'm very appreciative of the introduction from Professor Rosenblum and the chance to hear Dean Delbertis and Professor Berkowitz speak before me. Today, I'm going to be talking, I hope everyone has a copy of the handout that should be going around, because most of my slides speak for themselves, but a few of them have some details that you may want to look at more closely and carry with them. And what I'm going to do today is to talk about two remarkable upsurges of self-organized citizen activity that have spread across the United States in just the last decade. And to give you a sense of the kind of electorally sparked citizen organizing that I'm going to be talking about in the Tea Party of 2009 to 2011 or 12, although there's still some Tea Parties meeting, and the anti-Trump grassroots resistance, self-organized across many communities in the country that has spread since the November 2016 election. I'd like you to take a look at the two quotes that are up here. They are things that my colleagues and I heard from organizers of local groups in the Tea Party and the anti-Trump resistance, and notice the remarkable similarities. The husband and wife that my co-author and colleague Vanessa Williamson met and interviewed in 2011 in Arizona told us, "We've always voted, but being busy people, we just didn't keep as involved as maybe we should have. And now we're at the point where we're really worried about our country. I feel like we came out of retirement. We do Tea Party stuff to take the country back to where we think it should be." And that's the kind of message we heard from all of the grassroots Tea Party participants and organizers we met and interviewed and observed in different parts of the country, Arizona, Virginia, and New England in 2011 and 12. More recently, I've been traveling around the country to study what's happening in counties that went for Trump, in North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And one of the Wisconsin organizers of a local resistance group that I met told me in 2017, "I had always been a consistent voter and donated to my party and some select candidates, but I had not been super involved. Then the presidential campaign of 2016 became more and more ridiculous and frightening, and our very worst nightmare happened. My life changed overnight. My peace of mind was robbed from me. I was called to action. I feel like a soldier in a war trying to save this country, my children's future, the climate, and the list keeps growing. You know, the anti-Trump resistor is a little more wordy than the Tea Party people, but it's very much the same message of being called to action by a startling national electoral event. And before I proceed, let me just say to everybody here, protest and civil disobedience are important, but voting is the single most important thing a democratic citizen can do. I read in the New York Times today that only 1/3 of young people are getting ready to vote in the November election. It is perhaps the most important election in my lifetime, and I've been around for a while. Vote as you choose, but make sure you're registered and make sure you vote, and tell all your friends, your relatives, your friends across this country to do the same. So what I'm going to do today is to compare the Tea Party upsurge and the anti-Trump grassroots upsurge that happened after 2008 and 2016. I'll talk a little bit about what we've learned in my colleagues and I about the scope and the type of organizing that happened in the grassroots Tea Party and in the grassroots resistance, who leads and participates in the local groups that have formed by the thousands around the United States, mention a little bit about Obama and Trump as kind of focal points of the organizing on the two sides, the centrality of battles over health care reform, the relationship between bottom-up and top-down forces in these two loosely connected upsurges of organizing activity, and their relationship to the two parties at the two ends of the political spectrum. I'll be drawing on a whole series of studies. A lot of the work right now, including some I think you'll be hearing about at this conference, talks about the current resistance situation in terms of national movements and nationally organized advocacy efforts. The research that my colleagues and I have done, particularly Leah Ghost, a graduate student in sociology at Harvard, has worked with me on this work. We're looking at locally organized voluntary groups, not professionally run advocacy operations or even national internet operations. So that's what makes our research different. The evidence we have to answer the question, how widespread is the grassroots anti-Trump resistance beyond big cities and liberal places, are based on field observations and interviews, most of which I've conducted, as part of a study that was launched by 3 female professors at Harvard right after the election. After we got out from under the covers in our beds, we got together and decided that we would regularly visit 8 pro-Trump counties, one a medium-sized city area, a swing area, the other a smaller, more conservative place, 2 apiece in North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And my part of that work involves traveling to those places, which I love to do. I love to travel across the country, staying in quality inns, and getting to meet with local newspaper editors, the heads of the Democratic and Republican county parties, if they exist, any surviving Tea Party head, business group leaders, civic leaders of various kinds, and somewhat to my surprise, as my husband, who's a retired physicist, and I drove thousands of miles across the country, I discovered in all of these places self-organized anti-Trump grassroots resistance groups and got to meet their leaders and organizers, and in some cases attend meetings, just as we had attended meetings of local Tea Parties 8 years before. In addition to that, we have got to know the organizers of a kind of umbrella group, Pennsylvania Together, which has dozens of resistance groups affiliated with it across the pivotal state of Pennsylvania, and got them to fill out questionnaires about the origins of groups and the reasons people participated. So that gives us one entire state where we're not just looking at pro-Trump areas, but all kinds of areas, including the suburbs around Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. And the last part of the research is to compare back to the work that Vanessa Williamson and I did when we visited local areas around the country, observed Tea Party meetings, and sat down for face-to-face interviews with the leaders and key participants in self-organized local Tea Parties. So you have the timelines, and you can look at those in detail, but let me just start by reminding us about the events then and now. Barack Obama was elected the first African-American president in 2008 with a surge of liberal democratic support, youthful support, support by minorities. And it was only 6 weeks into his presidency when nationwide Tea Party protests organized and kicked off. Actually started a month into his presidency. In many ways, the National Spark event was a CNBC commentator, Rick Santelli, calling for Tea Party protests against, of all things, the mortgage assistance programs of the fledgling Obama administration. But that was picked up by Fox News, by right-wing talk radio hosts, by various advocacy groups who spread the idea of holding Tea Party protests far and wide. When I met local Tea Partiers a year later, many of them told me they heard about it on the radio or simply by watching television, and then started taking action themselves without anybody actually telling them what to do in any detail. By April, Tax Day of 2009, there were protests involving close to 1 million, 500,000 to 1 million protesters in 542 countries around the country. Some of these were major regional demonstrations. Those are the ones that got the most coverage, particularly on Fox, but also on the main networks at that point. But you can see how widespread the Tea Party self-organizing was at that point. And it didn't stop just with protests, with older people dressed in colonial costumes and carrying signs denouncing President Obama as a fascist or a communist, both, actually. From 2009 through 2011, at least 900 regularly meeting local Tea Parties, this is really the innovation in this period, were created. Our research since then suggests that we may have underestimated by about 400 or 500. There were regularly meeting Tea Parties, meeting once a month, sometimes as often as once a week, all over the country in that crucial first years of the Obama presidency. And now, 8 years later, another controversial president is elected. And in fact, the anti-Obama, Donald Trump. It didn't even take a month in this case. Instead, the organizing started right away after the November 2016 election, and on January 21st, right after the day after the inauguration, there was a massive women's march in Washington, D.C., and more to the point and of more interest to me, there were 600 marches across the country, including in very small and conservative parts of the country, joined by more than an estimated 4.2 million people. So even quicker and more massive response 8 years later. Immediately after the 2016 election, Democrats started saying that they were going to become more politically active than they had been before. And I don't have a comparable slide for Republicans after the Obama election, but I think the same was true back then. In the case of the anti-Trump resistance, interestingly enough, some commentators started appearing on MSNBC or in publications like The Nation talking about the lessons that anti-Trump resistors could learn from the Tea Party organizers 8 years before. So there's a certain amount of learning across time, imitation of tactics, and we know that several congressional staffers who organized the Indivisible effort sat down and wrote a guide that went online in late 2016 And that guide explicitly referred back to local Tea Party organizers, and I think delivered a message that liberals really needed to hear in the United States, which is if you want change, don't just contact Washington. At that point, there wasn't really anybody to contact in Washington. Organize locally and start doing things like community events, contacting the local office of your elected representative to express your views. So there are some very important parallels in the process by which these two upsurges emerged. And a big question in our research, especially for me, has been whether in our partisan polarized country, the anti-Trump resistance would simply organize in already liberal areas. Would it be concentrated around the big cities that gave overwhelming margins to Democrats in 2016, but absent in other parts of states that where Hillary Clinton lost by massive margins, much more massive than Obama did? Or would it be spread out like the Tea Parties were spread out? And so we're looking closely at the 4 states, and these are some results from 2 states, just looking to see how many counties in the states had 1 or more Tea Parties and 1 or more resistance groups listed on that indivisible map that was put together as a guide for people to figure out what was going on in their area. And you can see that in both Pennsylvania and North Carolina, these have both been very widespread voluntary grassroots mobilizing efforts. It's not exactly the same counties, but it certainly isn't a situation where all the organizing for the Tea Party is outside the big cities and all of the organizing for the resistance is in the big cities plus a few college towns. That's not the way it is. So let me talk a little bit about how grassroots resistance groups have formed, as I learned in detail in my visits to the 8 pro-Trump counties. It's a fascinating process, and I ask people to reconstruct exactly how they went about organizing a local group. Same as I did for the Tea Party when I talked to Tea Party organizers 8 years before, because one of the big questions is, do Americans organize regularly meeting groups anymore? And Bob Putnam and others have argued that it happens much less than it used to. And so since it has happened in both of these cases, how did that happen? Well, in every case, there were 10 resistance groups formed in these 8 relatively conservative-leaning counties. And 2 to 5 leader initiators were the ones who took the call in hand to start organizing. And 2 of the groups split off from previously organized ones, but all of the originally organized groups started right after the 2016 election. In fact, their founding meetings were held in libraries or local restaurants, usually by March of 2017 at the latest. So they got going pretty quickly. And of interest to me is that the organizers often met for the first time after the election. They weren't necessarily friends already, although they since become close friends. They might have met because they contacted each other through the Facebook group Pantsuit Nation, where a lot of people, mostly women, had signed up to celebrate Hillary Clinton's election, and then it turned into a mourning and support group operation right after the election. And they added a feature that allowed people to find out who was in their area. So some people met that way. Others met on, just as Tea Party organizers often did years before, on buses or trains on the way to regional or national marches and protests. A lot of the groups that formed did take some tactical advice from the Indivisible Guide. They didn't necessarily get any directions from a Washington, D.C. office. Indivisible staffed up and got millions of dollars and formed an office in Washington, D.C. by March of 2017, but most of the effect of Indivisible was through that guide that was online that people simply read and emailed or Facebook to each other in the early weeks. And a lot of the local groups did take some tactical pointers from that guide. They were all up and running by the spring of 2017. They had leaders, plans, projects, Facebook pages, and sometimes periodic newsletters, all led by leaders committing their time voluntarily and members coming to meetings on their own time. And when we did the questionnaires for the 36 groups across all different types of communities in Pennsylvania, we found very similar patterns. Here's what some of the groups look like in the smallest, most heavily conservative counties. I love these pictures. In Catawba County, North Carolina, you see them meeting for their founding meeting in the library. In Licking County, Ohio, you see them in the basement of the one liberal Protestant church in the town, and they are reciting for a YouTube video a credo, a citizen's credo, that resembles the credo that liberal Protestants recite in church, but it's adapted to politics. And in North Carolina, in tiny farming-oriented Monroe County, Wisconsin, that's a doctor leading the founding meeting. Well, our questionnaires have enabled us to pin down exactly who the people are that have organized this widespread voluntary grassroots resistance. And I don't want to disappoint some of the people in the audience who think that everything progressive comes from the young and people of color. The counties I'm visiting are overwhelmingly white places, so it shouldn't be a surprise that the organizers are white. But 2/3 to 90% of the leaders and participants in these grassroots groups are women, overwhelmingly white women, and usually older, from their 50s to their 60s. Although it is the case that sometimes local anti-Trump resistance groups have mothers in their 30s or 40s, sometimes with their children in tow. We never saw that in Tea Party meetings 8 years before. We saw only grandparental generation men and women, and sometimes they had a couple of unhappy grandchildren with them for the meeting. But the middle working-aged group was absent. 80 to 90% of the participants and organizers are college educated, and about half of them have advanced degrees. They are teachers. Sometimes they're professors or adjuncts at local or regional universities and colleges. They are healthcare providers or service managers, and a fair number of business women and nonprofit managers. Now, there are men in all of these groups, but they are usually the partners or husbands of the women who are kind of front and center. And that is different from the Tea Party situation, where the Tea Partiers were usually husband-wife couples. Often we saw women taking the lead in organizing voluntary activities in Tea Parties, so the idea that Tea Parties are all male is not right, but there was certainly a higher proportion of male presence in the Tea Parties. Just like Tea Partiers, in the early Obama years said that they were Republican-leaning or independents who were to the right of the Republican Party, most of the resistors say that they are Democratic identifiers of varying degrees of enthusiasm. They include certainly some independents and the occasional disgruntled Republican, and there are Bernie supporters as well as Hillary supporters in these local groups, but they're not spending any time arguing about the kinds of things the Democratic National Committee is arguing about. We asked people to say what their reasons were for participating in organizing and populating these local resistance groups, and you can see that opposition to Trump is a very important reason. 40% of the respondents to all of our questionnaires in both the 8 counties groups and the groups across Pennsylvania, there were 436 respondents overall. We allowed them to give more than one reason, or we coded more than one reason. 40% of them certainly mentioned opposition to Trump. But notice that saving or improving the country and American democracy is also very, very frequently mentioned by people. And the barred lines give the percent of all of the 765 reasons that we coded. And once again, that saving American democracy is very prominent in the motivations. People are also finding community with others. That's especially important in very conservative places, where the desire to reach out to like-minded other people when you're in a sea of red is very motivating for the women and men who participate in resistance groups. Electing Democrats and progressives is there, but it's not the most prominent reason, and you can see some of the others. And you can read some of the detailed reasons that people give in their own words.
Please use the microphone.
Okay. Now, I'd like to make a series of comparisons of these two upsurges. They were both triggered by an event that is actually pretty rare in American democracy, but doesn't seem rare these days, and that's the election of a president who's unusual, backed by, I'm going to say his because it's his, own political party winning both houses of Congress at the same time. That is a particularly frightening event to partisans on the other side. I mean, I remember how frightened everybody was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, when George W. Bush was, declared the victor. I'm not going to say won the 2000 election. Suddenly people woke up and realized that, an evangelical Christian conservative from Texas, backed by his own party, was going to be controlling Washington. And in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that's a deeply shocking event. So people did what many of the Tea Partiers told me they did after Barack Obama was elected with Democrats, yelled at the TV a lot. But the Tea Partiers went further. They self-organized. And the same thing has happened in the Trump presidency when the shock of Trump's victory, at the same time that Republicans remain overwhelmingly in control of the House and the Senate, has spurred as much out of fear and loathing, I would say, as hope, the self-organizing of the resistance. Now, what the controversial presidents exactly connote to the people who have organized in opposition to them is a little different in these two cases. Based on my face-to-face listening to Tea Party people in the past and even now, Barack Obama symbolized un-Americanness. In an interview, nobody is going to tell a Harvard professor right out, I hate him because he's black, or I hate him because he's an immigrant. They do say they hate him because he's a Democrat, or there's no hesitation there. And that they fear him because he might have a Muslim father. That's for sure. But he simply symbolizes un-Americanness, or as one gentleman said to me, there's something that doesn't add up there. And it's because of all of the things together that he represented: his race, his immigrant father, his urban background, the fact that he's a professor. Being a professor is a very bad category in Tea Party land. And of course, his Democratic Party affiliation. To resistors, Donald Trump is equally horrifying, but I think for slightly different reasons. He's seen as lacking the character and the qualifications to be president, and he represents disrespect and hatred in their minds toward women, minorities, and immigrants. And above all, I think he activates people because he represents a selfish disregard for the public good. So that's very much tied to that sense of saving American democracy that was a prominent reason that resistors give for organizing. And these presidents resonate with what each party, each movement represents. The Tea Party, Vanessa and I found in our discussions with activists, was not mainly about economic suffering. They were mainly middle-class, older white people who were not suffering the most in the economic downturns of 2009. They resented the changes, the sociocultural changes happening in the country, and feared them. Not just the racial and ethnic changes, the arrival of immigrants, that was the top issue everywhere we talked, and why even in 2011, many of the Tea Party people we interviewed were fascinated by Donald Trump because he had emerged on the public scene challenging Barack Obama's citizenship. But they also worried about young people and the direction the country was going with young people, including young people in their own families. They were fiercely opposed to the idea, not just that Democrats and Barack Obama would accomplish changes that they found frightening, but that the Republican Party, which they also resented at the time, might compromise too much with Democrats in Washington and the states. Today's resistance thinks in terms of threats to good government, rolling back of policy gains in the Obama presidency. There's a difference here because most resistors actually liked the Obama presidency. Most Tea Partiers disliked the George W. Bush presidency by the end, and were not so enthusiastic about John McCain either by the end of the election. So resistors see Trump and all that's happening as a threat to good government, to democracy, and to public policies that include diverse and less privileged people, even if they themselves are white and relatively privileged. The local groups have a lot of similarities across these two periods. I've already talked about how they were formed by organizers who often met for the first time, sometimes at rallies or on the way to marches. A couple of Tea Party organizers back then met when one of them read an op-ed by another one and looked her up in the local area. But they didn't know each other before they started organizing together. Internet and social media mattered in both cases, but it was the Meetup internet site that was used by Tea Parties, and it's Facebook that's used by these older resistors at the Grassroots. Tea Party groups usually met monthly, and their programs usually featured speakers provided by outside advocacy groups, with often people sitting there with remarkable patience through lectures that I considered to be incredibly dull. But they sat right there. As you can imagine, resistance meetings, which are often, at least at the beginning, they were also about once a month, and even now continue to be pretty regularly in most places. They're a little bit more like a sort of, let's get down to business, hear reports from the various subcommittees, decide how we're going to take the next steps. So there's less listening to outside speakers, but there is some in the resistance groups. Resistance groups are now meeting less frequently than they were at first, and that is probably a reflection of their greater willingness to form subcommittees and task forces to focus on different issue areas or different challenges in what they see as a constant barrage of challenges coming from Washington, D.C. And the resistance groups now are much more interested in federating with other groups around the Democratic Party in their area, not necessarily with the party, but with unions, with the NAACP, with churches, with immigrant protecting groups or refugee serving groups. Whereas the Tea Parties were often kind of themselves. And maybe they federated a little bit with each other, but mostly they were stubbornly autonomous and self-assertive in their own terms. Both the Tea Party back then and the resistance now fought long battles over the Affordable Care Act that passed in 2010. The Tea Partiers were mobilized to oppose the Affordable Care Act as it was being debated in Congress, and they also fought very hard against cap and trade or efforts to deal with global warming. The first year of the resistance, probably the single policy struggle that was most consistently mobilizing for local grassroots groups was the fight over whether the Affordable Care Act would be repealed in Washington. And I think that was pretty important because it kind of resonated with the concerns about the community and about health care that so many of the women organizing these groups had, and it gave them things to do because, for example, they would send delegations once a week to congressional offices, almost always Republicans in most of the areas, usually with some cupcakes to give to the staff, very polite to staff people, but with a constant message, don't repeal the Affordable Care Act. Now, they would hold community protests, they would hold various die-ins. Look at the die-in there in North Carolina using pro-life language to fight the Affordable Care Act's repeal. And in the Action Together Stark meeting, you see them at Representative Vernacci's office near Canton, Ohio. And you see a street demonstration in Hazleton, Pennsylvania of various local resistance groups. Obviously, in the end, they didn't persuade very many Republicans to back off repeal. Repeal almost happened. It was a senator from Alaska who doesn't owe much to Republicans for her re-election, Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, who you can never tell what she's going to do, but in this case, she went against repeal, and a dying Arizonan, John McCain, who wasn't going to run for re-election. But what did happen during the course of that year was the American public opinion went from being negative about the Affordable Care Act to being in favor. And so I think all that local organizing managed to finally do what Democrats had not done for 8 years, which is to communicate to ordinary people what was in the Affordable Care Act and why they and their neighbors had a stake in it. So it made a huge difference in my view. This is what happened with public opinion. You can see that in the early years of the implementation of the Affordable Care Act in 2013 and 2014, public opinion in the country was negative. Most Americans didn't know what was actually in the law, and Democrats never talked about it. Their consultants told them not to talk about it because it wasn't popular. But in the last year, as these local groups talked in detail about the stakes, public opinion shifted. So let me just say a little bit about a couple of other issues and then open the floor for discussion. Many of you may be thinking, well, didn't those tea parties get organized by the Koch brothers? The answer is no, they didn't. And I can prove it. I won't bother you with the statistics, but my research group studies the Koch network. We know how they operate. We know what a tremendous effect they've had. And we also have studied the emergence of the local tea parties. What these have to be understood at is top-down funding and activist manipulating operations intersecting with bottom-up self-organization, with the bottom-up and the top-down leveraging each other to push the Republican Party. You cannot collapse one into the other, and if you do, you will not understand what is going on out there. Similarly, the resistance against Donald Trump is a congeries of top-down operations, some of which have been professionally organized or beefed up since the Trump presidency, others of which have received millions of dollars from liberal and progressive donors to staff up at the regional and national level. But a lot of the action is these self-organized, voluntary grassroots groups. And they too, the grassroots groups like the Tea Parties of yore, are taking bits and pieces of ideas and resources and speakers and maybe some help setting up a website from the top-down forces, but they're kind of choosing from a menu and taking whatever they want from different places. And meanwhile, the top-down groups in both then and now put themselves in front of the cameras on Fox News or on MSNBC and tell us all that they're in charge. Well, they're not actually in charge. They don't control nearly as much as they think they control. And they don't control nearly as much as they tell their big donors they control. So you can see real tensions between top-down and bottom-up on policy priorities. For example, Tea Partiers back then cared mostly about resisting immigration into the United States and cracking down on law and order issues. And if they were Christian right people, they also cared about fighting abortion access and gay rights. the top-down groups in the Koch network and beyond that said they were orchestrating the Tea Party went on TV and told us that the Tea Party was about cutting Social Security and Medicare. Well, I can assure you it was about no such thing. The Tea Party activists were all on Social Security and Medicare. And they considered them, like most Americans consider them, to be earned benefits that are their right. In fact, two of my research colleagues attended an Americans for Prosperity event in 2015. They were participants, and they just went and observed. And they never saw any of the grassroots activists, some of whom were former Tea Partiers at the AFP, express any dissent in any of the sessions that they attended, with one exception. There was one session about entitlements, in which the speaker called Medicare and Social Security entitlements, like welfare. And the audience started grumbling. So there's a real disconnect between the top-down and the bottom-up. And similarly, some of you may remember that there was a kerfluffle, there's so many kerfluffles it's hard to keep up, but there was a big fuss about the DACA protections in the fall of, I believe it was 2017, and there was a lot of pressure from MoveOn.org and national advocacy groups tied to the resistance on Chuck Schumer to supposedly go to the wall to shut down the government over DACA funding. I mean, as a political scientist, I can tell you they had no such power, really. But that was what the top-down groups were pushing. And the National Indivisible organizers, who usually don't make this mistake, I think they understand that they're sitting on top of a self-organized congeries of grassroots groups, they put somebody on TV to claim that indivisible around the country, all the groups were demanding the closing down of government over DACA funding. Well, I checked in with my fellow researchers and all my groups, and we went back to all their Facebook pages, and we looked, and not a single one of them was demanding any such thing. So there are these tensions between different parts, and it's best to think of both of these manifestations as mutually jostling sets of organizations, not as one big organization or one big authoritative effort. Finally, I'll talk about the parties. We asked the groups across Pennsylvania to tell us what their relationships with the local Democratic Party were. Now, I need to point out that in some places there was no local Democratic Party. One of the counties I visited, nobody had been able to get the local Democratic chair to return an email, a phone call, a message. I mean, nobody, not even the local newspapers. And of course, he didn't respond to me either when I tried to set up an interview. The one time I did get him on the phone, I'm pretty sure he was in a Trump rally. So there might not have been an actual local Democratic Party in a lot of these places in the sense of an office and a set of people that could be contacted and groups of people who were actually doing things. But to the degree that there were, the relationships with the self-organized resistance groups ran the entire gamut. In some cases, particularly where pairs of women were in charge of both the party and the resistance, they might just join each other's efforts and work, push in the same direction. In no place did the local resistance groups want to collapse into the Democratic Party. That's partly because they were trying to reach out to people who didn't think of themselves as regular Democrats, either to the left or to the middle. But often in those cases there was a lot of cooperation, particularly around things like registering voters or fighting to save the Affordable Care Act. But in other cases, especially if local Democratic parties were led by old boy establishments that were mainly there to make sure that in low turnout elections they were reelected to local government offices, they were outright hostile to these new groups. Now that was then. By this spring, I would say across Pennsylvania, many of those old guard people have been swept out of office in the local Democratic parties, or local Democratic parties that had not much of a presence have had their committee people replaced, in many cases by resistance organizers. They continue to be separate efforts, overlapping separate efforts, but I think there's real change coming to the Democratic Party at the grassroots, at least in the places I know about. And the impact on the party and governing agendas is going to be, I suspect, quite different this time around than it was with the Tea Party some time ago. The Tea Parties were organized by activists who considered themselves solidly to the right of the Republican Party establishment at the time, and angry at Republicans for any kind of governing compromises. Over time, many of those Tea Party groups studied the rules of the Republican Party at their local and state level and took over offices. So in some cases, the Republican parties now are Tea Party people. In other cases, they're not. There are surviving Tea Parties in 2 out of the 8 counties I'm visiting, and I've gotten to know their leaders. But the Republican Party itself has changed a lot in the interim and is now much less compromise-oriented and has moved far to the right on the issues of concern to Tea Partiers. Resistors are not consistently on the left side of the Democratic Party. They are not Bernie Sanders, Our Revolution organizers. I didn't find a single piece of Our Revolution in the places I visited. And in some of the other places, there might be, people would say, oh yeah, there's a guy who stands up in our meetings and gives speeches. But for the most part, individual Bernie and Hillary people are simply getting on with it. And it's, and in a fairly pragmatic way, that is not necessarily going to drag the Democratic Party as a whole to the left. Now let me be clear here. I think most of these resistance groups are, they're liberals. They're so unabashed liberals or progressives, and they are prodding the Democrats to become more grassroots oriented and to run candidates even in places where they have not run candidates before. And in most places, you could say those candidates are to the left of what was there before, because what was there before is, in most places, Republican. But overall, it's not going to be like the impact of the Tea Party on the Republican Party, which was to drag it further to the right, particularly on social and immigration-related issues, in the process of remaking it. I think there'll be a remaking and perhaps a new rooting, local rooting of the Democratic Party out of these approximately 2,000 resistance groups across the country, but not necessarily pushing it consistently to what on a national level or in a conference like this we would consider to be the left. There's no question that voting was already being stressed by the time the second women's marches occurred in 2018. You can see grab them by the ballot, grab them by the midterms was another very common. And we've seen out of both of these movements a remarkable upsurge of people running for office. And these offices are not just the House, that's what's portrayed here, but local and state legislative positions as well, and that's true for the resistance groups, which is something new because Democrats had tended to neglect running for office at the local and state level in many of the states I'm visiting. You see the upsurge around 2010 on the Republican side and the comparable upsurge this year on the Democratic side. What's different is that on the Democratic side, it's overwhelmingly women running for office. Not only, and in many cases, it's men backed by these women going door to door, knocking on the doors, like for Anthony Delgado, going door to door. So it's not as if men are excluded or in any way discriminated against. It's just that there are more women who are organizing and more women saying, if they won't do it right, we'll do it. I think it's very much like one of the articles I read drew an analogy to the housework. If your husband can't fold the laundry right, you'll just do it. You'll roll your eyes and do it instead. And I think this is very similar. It's a pragmatic upsurge. We'll see how many of these women win. Many of them are going to lose. But losing is also important as long as there is a presence and long as there's somebody there to organize around and to make the arguments. Hopefully, it'll persist I say that in my citizen capacity. So the November 2018 midterm elections will be pivotal. I'm going to end on this. They'll help us begin to answer the question of whether the widespread resistance that has emerged since Donald Trump and his fellow Republicans took over Washington will help Democrats overcome what for them is very different from what the Republicans faced in 2010, because Democrats usually don't turn out in midterm elections. So it's a higher mountain to climb to see whether this resistance upsurge will help Democrats overcome their usual midterm turnout decline. And not only will they have to overcome it, they'll have to overcome it by a lot to take enough seats in the House and enough seats in state legislatures and enough governorships to really make a difference. I'm not sure what the impact of the recent Kavanaugh struggle will be. I do know that most of the women organizing in the local groups I talked about were not doing it mainly around Me Too issues or mainly around abortion access issues. They were, like women have throughout American history, organizing around the full array of policy issues. And I think it may turn out that the Kavanaugh struggle has less of an immediate impact than we think. Will grassroots voluntary resistance groups remain active if Democrats win the House and make state and local gains? Equally important, will they remain active if Democrats lose, as they will in many places? We don't know yet. It remains to be seen. My research group will be continuing to monitor the situation, and we'll see from that the full picture of whether the impact of this round of citizen organizing is comparable to the last round that the Tea Party sparked in 2009 to 11.
Sit down to take questions? Is that okay?
Sure. Especially if there's water there.
There is water, yes. Thank you. Oops, here, this is your microphone, so if that one works. Does it work?
Hi, can people hear me?
I think so. So thank you very much. You really, I mean, the ground covered was extraordinary. So many of my questions you answered along the way. I guess I'll just ask one very quick question and then turn to the audience. You gave what comes across as what could be seen as an extraordinarily optimistic picture of the capacity in American society for self-organized grassroots groups that continue to operate in a way that is unaffected somehow in their core by the influences of power and money, whether it's Fox News or the Kochs or you didn't say Soros, but we've been hearing that a lot. And you, in passing, you mentioned someone like Robert Putnam, who told us years ago that this capacity was diminishing, or the sustainable capacity for this was gone. If there aren't bowling leagues, is it possible to maintain this kind of structure, or will it come and go? In your studies of the Tea Party, you seem to have noted how incredibly effective they were at the local organizing and political end in changing local government and in changing the composition. Here, you said it's
Congress,
mixed.
really. Yeah.
Congress.
Yeah.
Could you comment a bit on that? Just in just what does Robert Putnam say to you? Does he look at you and say, "Oh my God, I mean, yeah, sure, this is a flash in the pan. We no longer have that capacity in a meaningful way to sustain it"?
Well, actually, he's come around, I see. But look, both Professor Putnam and I, Bob and I, have documented in different ways and explained in different ways a long-term decline in ongoing civic organizations. In my case, I documented that they were usually multi-level, national, state, and local, where people just, through thick and thin, and often not for political purposes as much as social purposes, continued to meet face-to-face. And there's no question that those are mostly gone. I mean, persistent groups are now usually professionalized, usually have a lot of money or spend a lot of time in fundraisers trying to raise more money. And there are, my research group on the shifting terrain actually has documented the activities of millionaires and billionaires who are organized on both the left and the right to give a lot of money to some of these professionally run groups. These electorally sparked citizen upsurges are really against the grain of the way in which organized American civic life has evolved since the late 20th century. But they're fascinatingly against the grain. They show that there's something in America's DNA that remains there. For one thing, the meetings are remarkably similar. And on the right, they start the way civic associations always started, with a Pledge of Allegiance and a prayer. There are no prayers or pledges of allegiance on the resistance side, but there is that kind of, we can do it, we can organize. We have to organize and assert our active citizenship if the country is to be saved. That kind of thing has swept the United States again and again since actually before it was the United States. So I do think that there's a similarity. There's also a difference. It rarely results in one big organization or set of organizations with an ongoing federated structure. And I think in many ways the activity is through or upon the two major political parties, which still have, at least in principle, a possible federated structure. And it is Bob Putnam's daughter, Laura Putnam, who teamed up with me. I teamed up with her, actually, to write the article that was in Democracy magazine called Middle America Reboots Democracy. And that's because she saw the same things in southwestern Pennsylvania. She's a professor at the University of Pittsburgh that I was seeing in my 8 Counties project. And Bob introduced us by email and urged us on, and then we kicked him out of the trio and just wrote our own article. But he agrees with it. He sees this as a possible renaissance of local organizing.
Thank you. All right, I see a question here, this man, the woman behind. Why don't we start with those couple of questions?
And ask them to introduce themselves.
Oh yeah, please do introduce yourself.
I always like to know who's here.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Mark Ray from Dartmouth College. Hi, my name is Mark Bray from Dartmouth College. Thank you for that very interesting presentation. It's fascinating research. My question is about language. So there's a photo from the original Women's March that's gone around on the internet where the sign says, "If Hillary had won, we'd be at brunch." And a lot of organizers who've been doing work around the issues that Trump has exacerbated recently said, yeah, exactly, that's the problem, is that if Hillary had won, you'd be at brunch. And so the response to a lot of the hashtag resistance in organizing circles among people who've been doing work on incarceration or police violence for decades was, oh, there's this group of middle-class, liberal white people who think they're the resistance, but we've been doing this work for years, and when Trump gets voted out of office and there's another Democrat in, they'll go to brunch and we'll still be doing this work. So I think it's really interesting to do your research on this specific cross-section of the resistance, but you often speak about it as the resistance, but it's just a cross-section of the resistance.
I said it was the grassroots resistance, and I use that phrase repeatedly.
You called the resistance on your sheet, it says the anti-Trump resistance. I would encourage you, it's super important, talk about it as the middle-class, white, liberal, rural resistance. This is not the resistance. And you didn't mention on your sheet J20, which is one of the most important moments of resistance recently. January 20th, the 200 people who were charged with decades in prison, which got no solidarity from the hashtag resistance whatsoever, or maybe a few small things. So please, be precise. This is one cross-section of the resistance. Thank you.
All right. Well, I said that there were many organizations organizing and jostling with one another. And if you look at my handout, it mentions some of the others. The United States, like it or not, is a federated political system. That means that political and governmental power has to be won by networks of organizations that have a presence across many places. Let me say that again. Political power is not won in the United States except by networks of organizations or movements that have a presence across many places. You don't see me talking in broad demographic categories or in ideological categories that refer to demography, because if the United States was one big demographic pile of people, Hillary Clinton would be president of the United States. And if Hillary Clinton were president of the United States, your movement would have a lot more possibilities for moving forward. Not because she necessarily stands for all you want, but because even moderate liberals in governmental power create more openings for organizing and leverage and policy change on the left. In my opinion, we face right now the possibility of a permanent minority, authoritarian, right-wing government. And as for violence, violence will be used on the right. Not very much or to any good effect on the left. So the reason that my colleagues and I are trying to understand how widespread the grassroots, boringly white middle-class, women-led part of the resistance is because we want to know whether there are going to be allies for Black Lives Matters, for immigration activists, for refugee activists, for anti-incarceration activists, for all of the groups that whose in my citizen capacity I approve of, to help take the kind of political power to open up some of the policy space for them to make headway. Now, that doesn't happen automatically, and I'll grant you that when a Democratic president is elected, hopefully with Democratic legislatures, because legislatures are even more important than presidents and governors, a lot of times the left has had a tendency to look for invitations to the White House, or to argue who is the real resistance. What a ridiculous argument that is. Rather than taking advantage of the political levers to protest and to get change that even moderate left power opens up. Now, you may not agree with my analysis, but that's my analysis. And that's why I'm talking about the geographical spread of these groups, not simply trying to reduce their activities or their outlooks or their impact to their biological demography. I think the left is too tied to biographical demography in this country. We got to get over it, or we're not going to get very far in recapturing and redirecting American democracy.
Could I ask people to not applaud? We can applaud at the very end and maybe keep it's nice to know the temperature of the room, but also maybe just keep it kind of the tone down and make sure your questions are questions.
It's okay.
No, this was actually a wonderful exchange and very useful, but I think the tendency towards an immediate kind of scolding in the questions is a little bit
I can
over
deal
the...
with it.
All right then. You might have invited even more. So the woman...
Scold me, I'm going to scold right back.
Two rows behind you, the woman who's right there, if we could get to the microphone.
Hi, my name is Miranda Kerrigan. I'm a sophomore here at Bard. I have one general observation and then one substantial question. I feel that...
Could you stand? We're not here, and really
'Cause I can't
project,
see
even
you.
with the microphone.
Great.
We're not hearing you so well.
Everyone gets to see me.
Oh,
Okay.
great. Okay.
Like, just an observation as a student here, a sophomore. Like, during the whole presentation, specifically like about the Tea Party, I realized very quickly that in 2009, I was 9 years old. And that there's probably a divide between the students and the academics who are here and who remember what the Tea Party was like.
That's why I handed out the facts.
Right.
You could actually read them.
Yeah. And really just thinking about how the people that are in college right now grew up with the Tea Party and with the Tea Party's criticism of Obama and how that might have affected us as the youth in the way that we've tried to affect change now, or hasn't, because maybe we don't remember what the Tea Party was like because we were so young. And I'm not really sure which one of those is right, but just like a thought. But as an actual substantial question, I think something that really struck me was the similarities between Obama and Trump as presidencies. Specifically the fact that when they're elected, the entire of Congress is one political party or the other. And the fact that both presidents were unique in their elections. But what also struck me was that this isn't something that was divided by time. It was right next to each other. Both presidencies were right after another. And I wonder what the future is going to lie, because there are a lot of Democrats that I know who think that we must take Congress back and we must have a Democratic president all at the same time. And I'm wondering if we're not going to have a counter-revolution to that again in the future, and what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, there's no question that the Obama presidency ended up sparking, and this is not anything about blaming Obama. So I'm not talking in blame terms, but his presidency absolutely activated ethno-nationalist fears and anger among a large proportion of older white people, particularly outside of metropolitan areas. Not among all white people. White people are divided in this country, very divided. But his presidency, I think precisely because of the happenstance that it coincided with Democratic takeovers in the House and the Senate, and with an economic downturn, and with what looked to many people on the right like a bold set of policies, even if they looked to people on the left like timid policies, that really sparked the kind of fearful pushback. But, you know, it's not only that. It also coincided with a decade and a half of Koch donor-funded national ultra-right organizing. And I didn't talk about that part of my research today, but the ground was prepared for the popular and voter reaction to Obama on the right by a very different kind of top-down, money-fueled organizing that if you want to read about it, it's September 2016, Perspectives on Politics. We have a paper called The Koch Network and Republican Party Extremism. Was about the way in which organized millionaires and billionaires organized by the Kochs and funding a political party-like operation on the far right actually pulled the Republican Party toward tax cutting, opposition to environmental policy, the kind of extremism we've now seen installed on the Supreme Court, all of that. So that was already there when this popular upsurge on the right occurred, and it was able to leverage that popular upsurge, even though they're often at cross purposes about what they care about. You don't see anything quite like that in the same way on the left in the United States. There are lots of left movements around important causes, but they tend not to have the kind of resources and organizational reach that right-wing organizing attained throughout the 2000s. So if you do have a president and a Congress elected that are all Democrats, that opens the possibility for policy changes. And, you know, I don't want to upset too many people in the room, but actually some important policy changes did occur during the first 2 years of the Obama presidency, and more was done through executive action after that. But it isn't as if there's a long-standing, powerful juggernaut on the left that can take advantage and push that further in the same way. So these moments, a lot matters about the moment against the backdrop of which they come in. And that's not all based on voters and popular protesters or even organizers of local groups. As for your point about not remembering the Tea Party, that's why you need to read about it. historical memory is two things. It's people's remembrance of their lives and what they hear from their parents and their grandparents and their friends and their teachers. It's also reading. And so read about it, because there are similarities and differences, and for people on the left, some horrifying lessons to learn, but also some organizing lessons to learn. And that's why the Indivisible Guide actually helped some of the center-left organizers, because it taught them some principles that the Tea Partiers had done before. And the fact of the matter is that the local Tea Partiers who organized were good citizens in the sense that they recognized that in America we have the right to organize it. We have the right to say what we think. We have the right to press for what we want. I personally happen to think they were pressing for terrible things. And interviewing them was often I had to go back and have a Tylenol before I went to bed. Because I would meet people that in many ways were personally admirable, who were organizing as citizens in ways I had to respect, and at the same time they were saying horrifying, hateful, and factually mistaken things. So, nevertheless, I learned more from that than from almost any other research I've ever done.
Should we have one more? Should we stop?
Sure.
Go two more questions?
Collect a couple.
Okay, why don't we take, I see right next to the woman who's speaking, Allison.
Yeah, thanks. Allison Stanger, Middlebury College. Thanks so much for that fascinating presentation. I thought what I would do is maybe ask a variant of the previous questions in a slightly different way, and just say that when I looked at the qualitative and quantitative data that you presented about both resistance movements, I saw some significant gender divides and significant class divides. So I wondered if you might comment a little bit on the importance of racism and sexism in explaining some of the differences we see today in our country.
Okay, let's take one more question then. Sir? Yeah.
This is kind of related to that. I mean, I like the way you pointed out the similarities.
Could you introduce yourself?
My name is Gary. The similarities between these two movements, but it seems to me that at the heart of the Tea Party movement is racism, is fear of the other, whereas at the heart of the anti-Trump movement is a fear for the ideals of American democracy. Is that simply my knee-jerk liberal opinion, or do you get a sense of that?
Well, I think that's pretty much what I said.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, that's...
We'll take one more question from this woman here. Is that what you'd like?
Yeah, and then there's a person in the back.
Where's the... Mike? And who is the person in the back, sorry, that you were saying?
There's a person in the back who's very eager, and we can hear from him too.
Hi, my name is Margaret Rubin. I'm a middle-class, college-educated white woman, and I don't teach here. My question is that I'm in Pantsuit Nation, I'm in my local Indivisible group, and the thing that struck me with your comments and also with the basis of the conference here is that in both of those, we have been told to play nice. And I'm wondering to what degree that is a differentiation. For example, in the original Indivisible pamphlet, booklet, whatever you want to call it, we were told, here are the things the Tea Party did that worked, but don't do the mean, icky things. Do take cupcakes, be nice, don't yell when you go to offices, don't threaten. And on Pantsuit, you know, moderators are constantly screening to keep things sometimes despairing, but upbeat-ish. So those are notable differences, and given the theme of whether civil disobedience will have violence, should have violence, might have violence, curious about your thoughts about that.
Okay, one last question then. I'm not seeing clearly a woman in the back.
Hi, my name is Awa Traore, and
Hi.
I'm a 11th grader in high school. Yeah, and I feel like a similar question might have already been asked, but based off your research, do you think that people actually despised Obama because of his political or presidential decisions, or was it that they didn't like his race and they couldn't be mad at that, so they directed their rage towards his political decisions?
Okay, this is a wonderful set of questions. You know, let me start by saying that maybe I didn't stress enough the goals and understandings of these two manifestations are quite different. And when I was discussing what the president that they oppose symbolizes to each side, I agree with the proposition that Tea Partiers grassroots Tea Partiers, many of whom have become hardcore Trump voters, are sparked by anger and fear about ethnic and cultural and racial changes in the country. Now, I want to be careful about that. Of course, in my interviews, people are not going to say to a professor from Harvard University, first of all, not everyone will talk to a professor from Harvard University, but I'm very good at worming my way into almost anyone. Since my grandfather would have been a Tea Partier, he was a farmer in Michigan, I can relate to people by talking about football or not fainting if a Bible verse is quoted to me. I was raised a Methodist. So, I can relate to people and I can treat them with respect. And when you treat people with respect, they will talk with you. Let me just say that's my fieldwork tip for all students. Just treat people with respect. Find something you can respect. Don't lie. And people will speak with you, and you will learn a lot from hearing what they have to say. So what I heard from people was fear and anger about changes in the country. Now, they certainly will say they hate Obamacare. But the interesting question is, why do they hate Obamacare? And people hate Obamacare because they thought it was giving people something for nothing, because they thought immigrants, which really are their biggest worry, immigrants, not African Americans, were taking advantage of it. And because that Obama, who in their mind was a world-striding tyrant. Imagine what it was like to go from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where people think Obama is a milquetoast, to talk to people who think he's the demon. But it's fear and anger about changes in the country that seem to be taking it away from the America they know and love, even more than they really are. So that's what I heard. Now, what I hear from resistors, and of course I agree with them a lot more in my citizen capacity, so I'm probably not hearing the same things that a conservative interviewer would hear, but I hear their anger about what is happening to government and democracy in this country, and their desire to do something about it, and their sense that Trump violates all that. So these are very different in their purposes. However, their demography is remarkably similar. They are middle-class white movements. And I just have to say, the United States is a country where middle-class white people, particularly women, have organized again and again throughout our history. And they may not be the glamorous ones, and they may not be the most left ones, but they often are the ones who actually do things when it comes to voluntary action. No question that on the Tea Party side, there were many more men, but they were more often the couch potatoes. It was often a woman who was leading a meeting that we saw, or arranging for the cupcakes to be sold to raise the money or the Sarah Palin biographies to be sold. I mean, whatever it was, like a church meeting. And so gender is not a perfect divide. There's no question that conservatives and conservative activists lead more male and have different conceptions of male and female roles. That's quite clear. So gender is very important in that regard. But it is not important in the sense that only men lead on the right and only women lead on the left. There are both on both cases. And race, it's just a fact that at the grassroots level, and frankly in liberal places as well as more moderate and conservative places, the voluntary group organizers are overwhelmingly white women. A lot of people have gone out and looked who didn't want to find that. And they found the same thing. There's a new book out called The Resistance, and they found some of the same things that we found. And I'm an empirical scholar. If the facts are the facts, the facts are the facts. That's the way it is. Might not be the way we want it. But attitudes toward race and toward the United States as a racially inclusive country and a country that welcomes immigrants couldn't be more different in these two movements. And I guess I'll just conclude by saying that I think, I want to talk about the violence thing too, but I think it's very important not to reduce people's attitudes and interests to their individual demography. Values and outlooks and things people aspire to learn and do matter as well. And because the United States is still an overwhelmingly white country, the war among white people is pretty important to non-white people, how it turns out. It's also important to the country. I'll speak personally and say that I think the very nature of America is at stake in our time in a way that I only remember being true back when I was young, when it was the Civil Rights Movement. Is the United States going to continue to be a country that weaves together so many different kinds of people into a powerhouse of innovation, inclusiveness, and fairness? Or is it going to be one more authoritarian tribe in a country full of them, in a world full of them? That's what's at stake, and very much at stake. Now, on violence, I think it's possible to be a very tough-minded civil moderate in manner. I think this is a time for enormous tough-mindedness on the part of people who think of themselves as liberals or centrists in American democracy. But yelling and insulting are not necessarily signs of strength. And the use of violence, which is pervasive in all aspects of American society, mostly non-political, is not a sign of strength either. I don't think we're in a period where there's going to be a militarized civil war. The negative outcome for Americans who care about an inclusive country will be a cynical, privatized, increasingly unequal country that simply continues its decline. It won't be violence, except against some of the people who try to speak up against that. So I don't think violence is a good tactic, and I don't think it's necessary to yell at congressional staffers when you go in to protest what the representative stands for. After all, the secretary and the staff assistants might not even completely agree with the boss. And they certainly aren't going to come around to thinking about the message you're delivering if you come in there while he's away and scream at them. It's just not necessary. And I think it's not tough-minded. I think tough-minded means to organize, to argue, to assert, to vote, and to keep holding politicians accountable after you elect them into office. And that needs a lot of tough-mindedness, but it doesn't need insults or violence.
Thank you. Maybe we can all join in thanking Professor Scotchpole. I'm sure that none of us will accuse her of being milquetoast. And so at 12:10, we're going to start the roundtable. So that's in 5 minutes.